Hi, I'm Jan Witkowski. I'm Director of the Banbury Centre here at Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory. The year is 2014, at least I hope it is, and we're here at the 79th Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory Symposium on Quantitative Biology. I'll get that right one year. And this year's topic is cognition. And I'm delighted to have Pat Churchland with me from the University of California, San Diego. Pat, you're giving two talks here on two rather unusual topics for a science meeting. One is on free will and the other is on morality. How did you come to get involved in these topics in relation to neuroscience?
Well, many years ago, I was a philosophy graduate student, and I was kind of disappointed that much of the philosophy that I was learning was really about how we use words, and I really wanted to know about the nature of things. And in particular, I wanted to know about the nature of the mind. And by then, certainly by 1969, it was pretty clear that all of our cognitive functions, our feelings and emotions, our perceptions, are really operations of the physical brain. And so it seemed to me that if I wanted to understand how we think and reason and make decisions, that I really needed to know as much as I possibly could about what neuroscience knows about the brain itself. And so that was what really kind of got me into the whole topic. And I was in many ways very fortunate because I was at a university in Manitoba, the University of Manitoba, where they sort of didn't mind what I did. And they gave me a tremendous amount of freedom. And so I was able to teach my classes as well as learn science from the medical school.
I have to ask you, I won't put words in your mouth. Was this regarded as something that a philosopher should do by the philosophers?
Well, no. This move was regarded as sort of crazy, as a failure to really understand the nature of philosophy and how it was that somehow by analyzing words we would get to the sort of deep truths of the nature of the world. And that strategy just really did not make sense to me. But in a way, it didn't really matter because I wanted to follow this route, and the fact that lots of people thought that what I was doing was ultimately futile, and some philosophers still do, didn't really make that much difference to me.
I think there's a parallel in psychiatry where the move from psychiatry and psychology into a brain neuroscience-based discipline has also been very strongly resisted by some psychiatrists.
That's a very interesting parallel, and I think that's absolutely true, that the Freudian framework really had a grip on psychiatrists until about the early 70s. And then the possibilities for biological psychiatry began to be explored in a systematic way. And there was tremendous tension between those who wanted to see psychiatric conditions as fundamentally conditions of the physical brain and those who thought we could just talk people out of it.
And this is clearly because we attribute special qualities to the brain compared, say, with our kidneys or our lungs.
Yes.
And I guess free will is an example of such a thing that is thought of as being something beyond the physical brain.
Certainly Descartes thought that. So in the 17th century, actually Descartes, to the best of my knowledge, was the first person to say that genuinely free will had to be uncaused, that it had to be just sort of created by the mind. And other people, especially the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, said, look, that doesn't really make any sense, that all of our decisions ultimately must be caused by our motivations, our memories, our drives, our emotions. They must all be caused. But what we really should be interested in, especially from the point of view of the law, is the difference between those causes that allow for what we call voluntary behavior and those that don't. And the way neuroscience has gone now, I think, exactly follows Hume's intuition. What we're really interested in are the kinds of habits, the kind of decision making that works in a healthy brain versus those that work in, for example, an addicted brain, or someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder, or someone who has lesions to the front of their brain and can't evaluate consequences and so forth. And for those kinds of cases, we realize that these choice and decision functions are not working well.
Right. And you would argue then that demonstrates that there is a biological free will.
There certainly is, I think, and it's easiest to see in the context of self-control. And we actually, as children are raised, we exploit the fact that the brain is a causal device and that children can causally acquire habits that allow them to suppress unwanted behavior. I mean, the first thing, of course, is they learn bowel and bladder control, or the very first thing probably is a baby learns not to bite its mother's breast. And that's because the mother yelps and says, "Don't you do that again." And so by using the reward system, by using approval and disapproval, we establish good habits, attitudes, and so forth in the developing child. We even help them acquire self-discipline and self-control.
So to what extent do you have to be conscious of the decision to exercise free will? I'm thinking that haven't there been studies that show that that we can make a decision before we're consciously aware of having done so?
Yeah, I think that consciousness plays some role, and it's not entirely clear. But one domain where I think the non-conscious habits and the non-conscious rationality play a huge role is in speech. I can't possibly make a conscious decision before everything I say, because if I do, I'm very quickly tongue-tied.
Right.
And so, and yet, what I am doing, as for example right now, is voluntary.
Yes.
It's not
it's
that it's sort of impulsive, it is thoughtful, or at least I hope so. It's based on past reflection and knowledge, but it all comes together in a very unconscious way.
Right.
And interestingly, we do, even though the background is unconscious, we do hold people responsible for their speech. So if in the course of a speech a politician says something that is extremely inappropriate, we hold him responsible. He doesn't get to say, I said those terrible things, but you know...
I wasn't aware, I didn't make the decision
I didn't
to do
make
so
a conscious decision to do that. We don't care if somebody says that. We say, you're still responsible. So I think that when you... And I think that it's not only speech, but a lot of our behavior involves this kind of interesting mix between habit and taking in consciously the conditions and the stimuli of the present occasion.
Yeah. I mean, clearly driving a car is very similar.
And driving a car.
You're obviously continuously aware of your environment, and you're making decisions about what to do without being aware at all.
Certainly without pondering anything very much. And I think this is true also in very fast sports. Now, golf, which I play, is very different. We're very deliberate about where we want the ball to go and which club we should use. But if you're playing hockey, and hockey is such a fast sport, you may make a decision to shoot rather than pass. But, that decision is not kind of just a reflex. It's based on all this past skill and habit and knowledge and understanding and very fast non-conscious processing about where your other player is and where the goalie is and so forth.
When you talk to people about free will, about this sort of neuroscience, biological approach, you must get a lot of kickback from people who just have to believe that they are sort of that they have complete free will, so to speak.
Funnily enough, not. I mean, often take our dogs to the beach in California because we live fairly close. And so for a while I used to just chat with people and say, well, what do you mean by free will? And they usually mean something that's very similar to what the courts mean. It means that you weren't forced to or coerced to do it. It means that you weren't involuntarily intoxicated. It means that you weren't insane. But then as long as you were a normal human being in command of your functions, yeah, you have it. But they don't mean anything sort of metaphysical and mystical. That's kind of left for philosophers.
Right.
And there are some philosophers who still want to think that every time we make a voluntary decision, it's sort of created with no causal antecedents.
I mean, that sort of, I think, partially leads on to the next thing I was going to talk about, which is moral values. In a way,
Yes.
I mean, religious people, don't they argue that you have to have free will in order to make moral judgments? That without free will we're mere automatons and robots?
Well, yes, and up to a point I sort of agree, in the sense that you have to have a degree of self-control. If you are so frontally damaged that you act on any impulse that your brain generates, then we don't think of you as having free will. And sometimes there are human subjects maybe damaged by stroke or by gunshot, or sometimes through developmental deficits, are unable to make appropriate decisions. Whatever the impulse is, they act on it. But the capacity that normal people with normal brains have, people who have been reared to have self-discipline, to not act on every impulse, but to suppress certain unacceptable, socially unacceptable impulses, or impulses that are personally unacceptable. That is, impulses maybe to try heroin or to try nicotine. And you think, I know that would be a terrible thing to do, and you suppress that impulse. I think that's very normal, and I think when the religious people talk about free will, it's actually that kind of thing that they have in mind. So I don't think the gap there is too huge. Where it is huge is the thought that it has a divine source.
Yeah.
I think of it as having a brain source.
Yeah, and you used the word social a moment ago. One of your arguments is it not that the biological neuroscience of the way that we are and our sociability is the root of our development of moral values? Is that essentially
that is essentially right. I mean, it's sometimes very tempting when you think about evolutionary biology and you understand that organisms compete to survive. And you think, well, that must mean organisms are essentially selfish. But as Darwin actually recognized, there comes a point where sociality actually helps you compete. And the very special case in which it helps you compete is in the case of mammals, where there must be caring of parents for offspring. And that's, of course, particularly true in the case of large-brained mammals, primates, including humans. And so there seems to be a kind of basic platform that's rooted in maternal care, but that can be expanded to care for mates, can be expanded probably via genetic changes, to care for kin, to care for friends, and as long as conditions permit, to care for strangers, other species, and so forth. And it's a kind of basic platform of going beyond caring only for oneself. And the reason it's there, of course, is that sociality allows us to have communal defense, to have cooperation, to share in foraging strategy, to share in the rearing of children, and so forth. So sociality, which has been invented many times in evolutionary biology, in the insects as well as in the mammals, as well as in the birds.
So that would lead me to expect then that if sociality is the foundation for the development of moral values, that all societies should no, okay, let me rephrase. So does that mean that all societies should have the same moral values, or that they have moral values of some sort that help their
Yes.
society?
That's a very good way to put it, actually. So the way I think of it is just as you last put it. That is that there's a basic platform of liking to be together, of enjoying the fruits of cooperation and so forth, although we are still sometimes competitive. But that with different groups, depending on different ecologies, there may be somewhat different superstructures,
Yeah,
that is,
right.
somewhat different social practices. So we find, for example, that the Inuit may value certain things more than, say, the Pitahaw who live in Brazil.
Right.
And that's because their lifestyle is very different. But fundamentally, this capacity, especially for caring for offspring, for mates, for kin, it's very deep in our biology.
Right.
It's part of what mammals are. And it's part of what makes us very successful, as it turns out.
You seem to have gone. This talk seems to be more sociobiology than philosophy. Do you consider yourself
Yeah.
a philosopher?
Well, I consider myself, in a way, a very old-fashioned philosopher, in the sense that, Aristotle was deeply interested in all of these questions. What is it that distinguishes somebody who makes good choices from somebody who doesn't? And he also, in his discussion of politics, thought of us as being essentially social in our nature. And he thought of much of morality consists, that is the social aspect as opposed to the personal aspect of morality, as consisting in trying to figure out how best to organize a group living, how best to organize ourselves to maximize stability and prosperity. And that's what I'm interested in. And so I think there's two parts to the story. There's the part of the story that's about biology, and then there's the part of the story that builds on biology and is about how we acquire habits, even very complex habits like forms of speech, and how we do social problem solving, how we come to realize, for example, that trial by ordeal is really not a good way to go, but trial by jury or trial by judges actually works better in the long run. And of course there are many other kinds of issues which I regard as essentially sort of social moral issues about whether it's okay to have oligarchies who have so much wealth they can control politics, whether we need a flat income tax as opposed to a graduated one. These are all questions that would have interested Aristotle.
Well, I think this may have been the first occasion in which Aristotle's been mentioned in one of these interviews. So I think we might stop there.
Okay, very good.
Thank you
Thanks
very
very
much,
much.